In this lesson, we are going to talk about solving quadratic equations, part 1. That image you see there on the screen is the path that an object that is thrown, dropped, kicked, launched will take as it's flying through the air. So that is one application of quadratic equations, which we will talk about later on in this course, but I thought I'd explain the image there. So what we're going to do in this lesson is we're going to talk about the difference between a quadratic expression and a quadratic equation, and then we are going to learn to solve quadratic equations by factoring. So this is one specific way to solve these equations. So first, quadratic equations. They come in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. An equation has an equal sign, and typically your goal is to solve it, which means to find the values of x that make the equation true. And then factoring, which we talked about previously, is a way to solve quadratic equations. Okay, so as you're going through the problems, pay attention to, one, if you're being asked to factor or solve, and also if there's an equal sign or not. Okay, in standard form, a is the coefficient or the number in front of x squared, b is the coefficient or number in front of x, and then c is the constant. Okay, it doesn't have a variable next to it, and this is a standard form of a quadratic equation. So getting into our examples, we're asked to solve for x, and we have x minus 1 times x plus 3 is equal to 0. If you were to multiply out these two factors, you would get a quadratic equation, but this is already factored for us. So we're going to talk about a couple things here. On the left-hand side, we're multiplying two things together, and we want it to equal 0. So a couple things to remember. You may hear this as the zero product property, but 0 times any number is 0, or any number times 0 is 0. So what that translates to is if this factor is equal to 0, then the product or the multiplication will be equal to 0. Or if this factor is equal to 0, then when you multiply it by whatever is next to it, your answer is going to be 0. And the reason we're looking for 0, again, is because we want to make our equation true. So the left-hand side has to equal 0 because the right-hand side equals 0. Okay, so the way to do that then is to set each factor equal to 0. And this only works for 0, by the way. If the right-hand side was 2, or let's use 24 for instance, there's multiple ways to get a product of 24. So the reason this is working is because 0 times any number is 0. Okay, so if we solve this first equation, we add 1 to both sides, x equals 1, subtract 3x is negative 3. Okay, and typically we're looking for two answers, the x being squared, or if you multiply that out, tells us that we are looking for two answers. Okay, and you might have seen it from here. 1 minus 1 is 0, so 0 times whatever this ends up being is 0, or negative 3 plus 3 is 0 times whatever the left factor is would also be equal to 0. Okay, so let's continue on. Example 2, solve for x. So when an equation is already in factored form like this, you could multiply it out, but all you'll end up doing is factoring it again to get to this point in time to use the zero product property. So we take each factor and set it equal to 0, and then solve each equation for x. Okay, so we'll add 1 to both sides to get 2x equals 1, and then to solve for x, we'll divide by 2. So this is x is 1/2, and it's perfectly okay to get a fraction. For 8x plus 9 equals 0, we'll subtract 9 from both sides to get 8x equals negative 9. And then we'll divide both sides by 8 to get x is equal to negative 9 over 8. Okay, so those are your two answers. You may see it as it'll be written the solution set is, and then it'll have braces. You would put 1/2 and negative 9 over 8. Let me make that a little bit more legible. Negative 9 over 8 with the brace. Okay? Some more examples. So solve for x. X squared minus 5x plus 6 is equal to 0. So if you're going to solve by factoring, you want to make sure that your quadratic equation is equal to 0 so that you can use the property we previously talked about. So to factor here, we're looking for two numbers that multiply to 6 and add to negative 5. Okay. In this case, we're looking for two negative numbers because it's adding to negative 5. So that's going to be negative 3 and negative 2. And then we take our two factors and set each of them equal to 0. You can check your answers too, by the way, by plugging in x into the values you get for x into every x in the original equation. Okay. Add 3. So one answer is 3, and the other answer is 2. Okay. Solve for x. So here we have x squared is equal to 8 plus 2x. If you're going to solve by factoring, all of your terms need to be on one side. and then the other side needs to be equal to 0. So you want this to be set equal to 0 when you're solving by factoring. Okay, so I'm going to move over the 8 and the 2x. Okay, and if you write it as x squared minus 8 minus 2x equals 0, remember that in standard form the powers are descending, or it goes x squared x and then your constant. I would rewrite that because you're not finding two numbers that multiply to -2 and add to -8. That's not how this works. You're looking for two numbers that multiply to -8 and add to -2, okay? And you see that when it's written in the correct form. So here we have x minus 4 and x plus 2 equals 0. So then we set each factor equal to 0. Okay, so we get x is 4 and -2. And another one, x squared plus 11x is equal to -28. Again, we need to move over the 28 so that this is equal to 0 as we're discussing solving by factoring. Okay, so I'm going to add 28 to both sides to get x squared plus 11x plus 28 is equal to 0. We're looking for two numbers that multiply to 28 and add to 11. So that would be 7 and 4. Okay. So we have x plus 7, x plus 4 is equal to 0. And then we set each factor equal to 0. So here we get x is equal to -7 and -4. So those would be our two answers. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me.